The throne world of seeming had never once been seen as it truly was, and that was the point. For 1900 years, the resplendent throne ruled the galaxy by deciding what every living thing was allowed to perceive. It did not conquer with fleets, it conquered with the eye. A species was shown a throne so vast it filled the sky, a fleet so endless it had no edge, a power so total that resistance was not even a thought a mind could finish. The throne called this gift the seeming, and every world under it knelt not to ships, but to the picture of ships, and the picture never lost. Sub-Herald Aemon, Sar believed in the seeming the way a fish believes in water. He had stood in the great hall of showing on the day they crowned the new eye, and he had watched 10,000 envoys from 1,000 subject worlds weep at the sight of the throne's true splendor. He did not know that no two of them had wept at the same image. The seeming gave each mind the exact picture it could not refuse. That was its mercy, and its leash. He had been raised inside the work of it. His mother had been a weaver of the third rank, and he had grown up in the quiet halls beneath the showing hall where the threads were spun, learning before he could speak that the world above was a thing that could be adjusted. He had thought this knowledge made him special. He had thought that knowing the picture was a picture set him above the worlds that wept at it. He understood, much later, that he had been the most deceived of all, because he had believed he was outside the lie while standing at its very center, turning the loom. The throne taught its heralds a simple lesson, and Aemon Sar had carried it for 40 years like a stone in his hand. No power in the galaxy could match a power that owned the eye. A fleet could be outbuilt, a wall could be broken, a weapon could be answered with a better weapon. But the thing that decided what a mind was allowed to see came before all of those, because a species that could not perceive an enemy could not fight one, and a species that perceived an enemy 10 times too large would never try. The throne had never lost a war, the herald said, because the throne had never fought one. It had only ever shown its enemies the war already lost, and let them surrender to a future that had not happened. For 1900 years this had been enough. The galaxy was wide, and the throne was old, and 1,000 worlds turned in their orbits beneath a sky that was painted fresh each morning by 900 generations of patient hands. Trade flowed up the pilgrim lane. Tribute came in on time. The subject worlds were not unhappy exactly, because the seeming was careful never to show them anything cruel enough to make them desperate. It showed them only the one thing they could not bear to disbelieve, and let the rest of their lives go on. It was, the heralds agreed, the gentlest empire that had ever existed, and Aemon Sar had believed that too, because he had never once been given a reason not to. So when the long-range choir reported a single object crossing the dark border of the quiet fringe, Aemon Sar felt no fear. He felt only the small irritation of paperwork. One ship, cold, slow, coming straight up the pilgrim lane toward the throne world, making no signal, asking no leave, showing no seeming of its own. It carried no fleet behind it. It carried no banner the choir could read. It simply came, the way a stone comes down a hill, and the throne's first instinct was the instinct of every power that has never been touched. It reached out to show the stranger the picture that ended all strangers. The eye of the throne turned its attention to the lone ship and began to weave. In 1900 years, the weave had never failed. It found the watching mind, learned its deepest fear in the space of a breath, and built that fear into a wall of light 1,000 ships high. A predator empire saw a hunting pack 10 times its own. A trade league saw its every coin turned to ash. A war fleet saw its own admirals kneeling. Whatever a species could not bear to face, the throne built it, and the species turned and ran, and the running became the truth. Aemon Sar had watched the weave work more times than he could count, and it always filled him with a quiet pride, the pride of a craftsman watching a perfect tool do perfect work. He remembered the Velmari, a clever, restless people, who had come up the pilgrim lane 4 centuries ago with real ambitions and a real fleet, meaning to test the throne's edges. The eye had simply shown them what they feared most, which was their own irrelevance, a galaxy that had forgotten them entirely, and the Velmari had turned home and never came again, and were forgotten, exactly as the weave had promised them they would be. He remembered the Bros, a herd people who feared the open dark, and how the eye had shown them a sky with no stars at all, and how they had begged to be allowed to kneel just to be given back the stars. The weave never had to invent anything. It only had to find the wound already inside the watcher, and press. That was the genius of it, the thing the heralds taught with reverence. The throne never lied about the world. It lied about the watcher. It took the deepest true fear a species already carried, and made that fear the whole sky. And a species cannot disbelieve its own fear, because the fear is not out in the world where it can be checked. It is inside, where there is no checking, only feeling. For 1900 years, no species had ever found a way to put a wall between its own fear and its own eyes. It had never occurred to anyone that such a wall could be built, that a mind could be taught to feel the fear and refuse to let the fear paint the sky. It had occurred to one small blue world, but the throne did not know that yet. The eye reached into the cold ship and searched for the fear. It found nothing it could use. Amon Sar had seen the weave work 1,000 times, and it always worked the same way. The eye sent a thread of attention out across the dark, faster than any ship, and the thread touched the watching mind, the way a finger touches the surface of still water. In the touching it learned everything, not the surface thoughts, which lied, but the deep ones, the shapes a mind was built around, the thing each species had spent its whole evolution learning to run from. A herd species feared the open. A burrowing species feared the closing dark. A proud species feared shame more than death. The eye found the shape and built the wall, and the wall was always the right wall, because it was made from the watcher's own deepest material. And you cannot disbelieve a thing your own mind agreed was the most terrible thing in the world. The thread went into the cold ship and came back with nothing it could hold. It was not that the human minds had no fear. The weavers were very clear about this afterward, in the days when they still tried to explain it. The humans had fear. They had a great deal of it. They feared the dark and the cold and the closing in and the falling and the dying, the same as every soft living thing in the galaxy. But the fears were not where the eye expected to find them. They were not raw. They were not running. They had been taken out and looked at, over and over, on purpose, until the looking had worn the edges off, and a thread of attention that reached for a screaming animal terror found instead a thing that had been studied, measured, filed, and set carefully back in its place. The humans were afraid. They had simply stopped letting the fear decide what they saw. Amon Sar was standing at the rail of the showing hall when the first weaver staggered. He saw it with his own eyes. The weavers were the throne's living instruments, minds bred for 900 generations to hold the seeming steady, and they did not stagger. This one pressed a hand to the bright glass of its station and made a sound Amon Sar had never heard a weaver make. A small sound, a confused one. "It will not take the picture," the weaver said. "I show it the wall of ships. It looks, it does not believe." A senior herald laughed, because that was the correct response. Every mind believes, show it deeper. The weaver showed it deeper. Amon Sar watched the great glass fill with the most terrible image the throne kept, the one shown only to the proudest worlds, the sight of a sun being snuffed like a candle between two enormous fingers. It was the picture that had broken the sword kings of Hadral in a single afternoon. The Hadrali had ruled 40 systems, and they had laid down their weapons before that image, and never picked them up again. The cold ship looked at the dying sun. Then it did something no subject mind had ever done in the whole history of the seeming. It corrected the math. A signal came back up the pilgrim lane, narrow and flat and utterly calm. And it was not a plea, and it was not a scream. It was a note. The signal said that the displayed sun was the wrong mass for the displayed collapse, that the radiation curve was off by a factor the ship listed to 4 decimals, and that whoever had built the image had never actually watched a star die. The signal ended with a single line that the choir translated, and then translated again, because the heralds could not believe it. "You are showing us a painting," the ship said. "We came to meet the painter." The showing hall went silent. 1900 years of silence had a particular sound, and this was not it. This was the silence of a thing that does not have a procedure. Amon Sar would remember, for the rest of what was left of his life, that his first feeling was not fear. It was offense. The creature had insulted the seeming. It had looked at the holiest weapon in the galaxy and called it a painting, and somewhere under his offense, a colder thought was already moving, the thought he would spend the next days trying not to think. If the ship could not be shown the false sun, then the ship could see the real one. And if it could see the real galaxy, then it could see how few ships the throne truly had. The eye recovered its poise quickly. Heralds do not panic in the showing hall. The order went out to the border garrison, the 11th Bright Lance, 200 warships of the Inner Ring, real ships, hulls and not pictures, kept precisely for the rare day when a mind proved too broken to be shown the truth that saved it. They were ordered to meet the cold ship at the edge of the Pilgrim Lane and remove it, quietly, before any subject world's choir could catch the strangeness of a thing the seeming did not touch. 200 real ships against one. Amon Sar relaxed. Whatever this creature was, it had never met the part of the throne that was not a painting. The bright lance was steel. The bright lance was guns. The cold ship would learn the difference between a seeming and a sword. The cold ship answered the order to halt with one more line, and the choir read it out in the dead quiet of the hall, and Amon Sar wrote it down without knowing why his hand was shaking. "This is the Earth warship Veilbreaker," it said. "We have been listening to your paintings for 200 years. We learned to close our eyes. Now open yours." The 11th Bright Lance came up the Pilgrim Lane, in the perfect fan the throne had drilled for 19 centuries. 200 warships spread across the dark in a wall of gold, and every one of them was wrapped in its own seeming, so that any watcher would see not 200, but 2,000. That was the law of the lance. You never showed an enemy your real number. You showed them the number that ended the conversation. The Veilbreaker came on into the fan without changing speed. Amon Sar had served the throne for 40 years, and he had never once watched a real battle, because the throne did not have real battles. It had showings. A showing was a thing of great ceremony. The enemy was brought into the fan, the seeming was raised, the enemy's mind broke, and the surrender was recorded with full honors and added to the long roll of bloodless victories. The heralds in the hall expected exactly this now. They had their styluses ready to record the surrender. The senior archivist had already begun composing the entry, naming the cold ship the Stranger of the Quiet Fringe, and noting the date and hour of its capitulation, leaving only the time to be filled in. The time was never filled in. Amon Sar watched the whole thing in the showing hall through the eyes of the lance itself, the feed pouring down the choir into the great glass, and he watched the cold ship grow from a point to a shape to a thing with edges. It was not beautiful. The throne built beautiful ships, ships like jewelry, because a beautiful ship was easier to make terrible in a seeming. The Earth ship was none of that. It was long and gray and plain, scarred along one flank with the marks of old burns nobody had bothered to polish out, and it carried its weapons the way a working hand carries old tools, without ceremony, ready. The commander of the lance, High Lance Vero Tan, opened with the seeming, because that was always how the lance opened. 200 ships became 2,000 in the cold ship's sensors, a tide of gold filling every angle of its sky, guns enough to crack a moon, and the throne's law said that at this moment the enemy mind broke, and the battle was already won before a shot was fired. The Veilbreaker did not break. It spoke instead, and the message it sent was not aimed at the lance. It was aimed past the lance, broadcast wide and slow on the Pilgrim Lane's own carrier, so that every subject world's choir within 9 light-years would hear it whether the throne wished it or not. Amon Sar felt the first true thread of cold go through him when he understood what the ship was doing. It was not fighting the fleet, it was talking to the audience. "The ships you see are not there," the Veilbreaker said to the listening galaxy. "Watch." And the Earth ship opened fire on the empty space between the false hulls. This was the moment, Amon Sar would later understand, that the throne lost the war, though no one in the showing hall knew it yet. The Veilbreaker had spent 2 centuries listening. It had mapped the seeming the way a builder maps a wall, knock by knock, and it knew that a seeming projected ships into the spaces where no ship was, because 200 could not fan as wide as 2,000 without leaving gaps the imagination had to fill. There was a thing the heralds never said aloud, a flaw in the seeming, so basic that the throne had simply learned to live with it and trust that no one would ever notice. The flaw was this: a picture of a fleet has to be larger than a real fleet to be worth painting, or there would be no point in painting it. The whole reason to show 2,000 ships instead of 200 was to fill more sky, to leave no gap, to surround the enemy more completely than steel ever could. But that very largeness was the weakness, because a painted ship is woven from light alone, and light passes through light. The false hulls could loom and threaten and fill the dark, but they could not stop a single round, and any enemy who fired into the spaces between the real ships would prove, instantly and to everyone watching, that the spaces were empty. For 1900 years, no enemy had ever fired into the gaps, because for 1900 years, every enemy had been too busy running. The Earthship did not run. The Earthship looked for the gaps on purpose, because Earth had known about the flaw for 2 centuries and had crossed the galaxy specifically to put a round through it where 1,000 worlds could see. So the Earthship aimed at the gaps. It fired into the gold where the law said warships hung, and the rounds went through, and the gold did not bleed and did not burn and did not so much as flicker, because there was nothing there to flicker. 9 light-years of subject worlds watched a human warship shoot straight through the unbeatable fleet of the resplendent throne, and hit nothing, because there had been nothing to hit. It is hard to explain, to anyone who did not grow up under the seeming, how enormous a thing this was. For 1900 years, the great unspoken law of the galaxy had been that the throne's fleet was beyond counting, and beyond counting meant beyond resisting, because you cannot plan against a number you cannot know. Every subject world had built its whole understanding of reality on this one foundation. The throne was infinite. The throne could not be measured, and here, on 1,000 choir feeds at once, a single gray ship had fired into the infinite fleet and shown that the infinity had gaps, that the gaps were empty, that the thing beyond counting could in fact be counted, and that the count had just begun. A foundation does not crack loudly. It cracks in silence, deep down, where no one is looking, and then one day the whole house leans. In the showing hall, a herald named Aulus the Pale, who had served the eye for 60 years, said the word that no one was allowed to say. He said it very quietly, almost to himself, and Aemon Sar heard it, because he was standing close. "They will count us now," Aulus said. The High Lance did the only thing his training left him. He stopped showing 2,000 ships and showed his real 200. Hulls bared, guns hot, and he gave the order to burn the gray ship out of the lane. 200 warships of the inner ring, the finest steel the throne possessed, turned every weapon they owned on a single Earth vessel, and the light of it was so great that the choir feed whited out for a full 3 seconds. When the glass cleared, the veil-breaker was still there. Aemon Sar leaned forward against the rail without meaning to. The Earthship's flank was glowing, a long bar of hurt across the gray hull where the lance's fire had landed. And it had landed. This was real. This was steel meeting steel, and not a painting being argued with. But the ship had not slowed, it had not turned. It had taken the full weight of 200 warships, and it had simply kept coming up the pilgrim lane, and now it was answering, and the answering was nothing like the seeming at all. The throne fought with pictures. The Earthship fought with patience. Aemon Sar found that he could not look away from it. There was a horror in the watching, but there was something else under the horror, something he did not have a name for yet, and would not find a name for until the very end. The Earthship was so calm, that was the thing that frightened him most, more than the guns, more than the dead lance ship drifting cold. The Veilbreaker fought without anger, and without glory, and without any of the great loud feeling that the throne taught was the soul of war. It fought the way a careful person does a difficult sum, checking each step, never hurrying, never afraid, and the calm of it reached down the choir feed and into the showing hall and made the heralds, with all their 1900 years of certainty, feel for the first time like the smaller thing in the room. It did not waste a shot. Aemon Sar had spent his life watching the lance drill, watching ships pour out their guns in glorious wasteful sheets of fire, because the fire was for the watcher and not the target. The Veilbreaker fired the way a man drives a nail. One shot, one hull. The first round took the lead ship of the fan through the throat of its drive, and the ship did not explode in glory, it simply stopped, gone dark, and dead and drifting, and every choir in 9 light-years saw a ship of the unbeatable throne die in total silence with no seeming to dress its death. That was what undid them, not the dying. The galaxy had seen ships die. It was that the Earthship gave the deaths no story. The throne had ruled for 1900 years by being the only one who got to say what a thing meant, and the Veilbreaker stripped the meaning off every kill and left it bare. A dead ship, and then another dead ship, while it spoke to the watching worlds in that flat, patient voice, and told them, simply, what they were seeing. That was a real ship, it said, as the second lance vessel went dark. There are not many. We are counting them for you. High Lance Verotan was not a foolish being. He had risen through the lance on real merit, in the small, hard wars the throne fought in the dark where the seeming did not reach. And he understood faster than the heralds in the hall what was happening to him. He understood that he could not win by killing the Earthship, because the Earthship had already done the only thing that mattered. It had been seen, and you cannot unsee a counted fleet. So he did the brave thing and the doomed thing. He ordered the lance to close, to swarm, to bring 200 guns to bear at a range where even an Earthship could not survive, and to end this in one overwhelming press before the count went any higher. The lance closed. Amon Sar watched 200 warships fold inward on a single gray hull like a fist, and for one moment the old certainty came back to him, the warm, sure feeling of 1900 years, because surely now, at this range, with this weight, the matter was settled. The Veilbreaker had been waiting for the fist. It did not run from the closing ships, it dove into them. The Earthship cut its drive and let the lance's own closing speed carry it into the center of the fan, into the one place where 200 ships could not fire without firing through each other. And there, in the heart of the fist, it lit its full weapons for the first time. Amon Sar finally understood why the ship had seemed so plain. The throne built ships to be looked at. The Earth had built this one to be in the middle of an enemy fleet at point-blank range, and every weapon it had was placed for exactly that, short and brutal and all around. A thing that did its real work not at distance, but inside the embrace. The fist closed on the Veilbreaker, and the Veilbreaker took the fist apart from the inside, one wrist at a time. The throne had built the lance to fight the way the throne fought everything, from the outside, at a distance, with the enemy always able to see the full terrible spread of the fleet. That was the geometry of fear. You stood off and you loomed, but the Earthship had refused to let itself be loomed at, and now that it was inside the fan, the whole logic of the lance turned against it. 200 warships had been built to surround. They had never once been built to be surrounded. They could not bring their great forward guns to bear without sweeping them across their own sister ships. They could not maneuver without colliding. They were a fist, and a fist is a terrible thing to be when the enemy is already inside the palm, because every finger that closes only crushes the others. It was not glorious. Amon Sar wanted it to be glorious, wanted the dignity of a great battle, and the Earthship denied him even that. It was methodical. It was quiet. The Veilbreaker rotated in the center of the collapsing fan and put single, precise rounds into the drives and the spines and the magazine throats of the ships around it, and the lance, packed too close to maneuver, too close to fire without hitting its own, came apart in a slow, grim arithmetic that the Earthship narrated to the galaxy the entire time. 40, it said. There were 200. Now there are 40 real ones left. The rest were always paintings, or are now scrap. We are nearly done counting. Even then, even with the lance dying around the Earthship in real steel and real fire, the eye tried the seaming on the Veilbreaker itself, because the seaming was all the eye had. It wove the dying sun into the cold ship's sensors. It wove the wall of 2,000 ships, and Amon Sar, standing at the rail, asked the senior weaver in a voice he barely recognized as his own, why the weave would not take. He had to ask twice before the weaver answered, because the weaver was old and proud and had held threads for 90 years, and there are some questions a master does not want to hear from a junior. I am showing it the most terrible things we keep, the weaver said at last, and it looks at each one, and it does the same thing. It measures, it checks the light, it compares the picture to a number it carries inside, and it sets the picture aside, the way you would set aside a coin you knew was false. I have woven for 90 years, Sub-Herald, and I have never met a mind that would not buy a false coin if it was frightened enough. This one is not frightened. Or it is frightened, and it has simply decided that being frightened is not a reason to stop counting. High Lance Verotan gave one last order, and Amon Sar would think about it for the rest of his life, because it was the order of a being who had finally, completely understood. He did not order a charge. He ordered his 40 surviving ships to drop their seemings, all of them, at once, fully and forever, and to show themselves to the watching worlds exactly as they were. It was the bravest thing Aemon Sar ever saw a servant of the throne do, and it was treason, and it saved more lives than any weapon ever forged. Aemon Sar did not understand, in that moment, why a defeated commander would do such a thing. The law of the lance was absolute. You died inside the seeming. You died as 2,000 ships, glorious, terrible, undefeated even in death, so that the watching worlds would remember the picture, and not the corpse. To drop the seeming was to hand the enemy a confession. It was to tell the entire galaxy the one secret the throne had killed to keep. Why would a loyal commander, in his last minutes, betray the whole foundation of the empire he had served his life? He understood much later, after everything, when he had time to think about the kind of being Vero-Tan had been. The High Lance had spent his career in the small, hard, real wars in the dark, the ones the seeming did not reach, and so he was the rare servant of the throne who had actually seen real combat, real death, real ships dying for true reasons. And a being who has seen the real thing cannot fully unsee it. Somewhere under his loyalty, Vero-Tan had always known the difference between a ship and a picture of a ship, and when the Earth vessel forced the choice on him, he found that he would rather his 40 real crews live as themselves than die as a painting. It was the most human thing Aemon Sar ever saw a non-human do, and the Earth ship, watching, did not fire on the bared survivors, because the Earth ship recognized it too. 40 ships. The galaxy looked, and where the law of the lance had always shown 2,000, there were 40, and every subject world for 9 light years did the small, terrible sum at the same instant. If the unbeatable inner lance was 40 real ships wearing the mask of 2,000, then the endless fleets that ringed the throne world, the tides of gold that filled the sky of every conquered sky, the numberless armadas that had kept 1,000 species kneeling for 19 centuries, were all wearing masks too. And masks could be counted. In the showing hall, the Eye of the Throne did the only thing 1900 years had left it able to do. It ordered the choir to cut the feed, to stop the broadcast, to seal the pilgrim lane, and pretend the veil-breaker had never come. It was far too late. The count was already loose in the galaxy. But the throne had never in its whole history needed to actually win a fight, and so when it finally faced one, it reached for the only tool it had ever owned. It reached to control what people saw. The Eye turned the full weight of the seeming, the whole woven mind of 900 generations of weavers, upon the veil-breaker. Not 200 false ships now. Everything. It showed the Earth ship its own death 100 ways at once. It showed it Earth burning. It showed it the entire combined might of the throne, every real and false ship at once, descending in a wave that filled the universe. It reached for the deepest fear in the human mind, and found, the weavers reported with rising panic, that it could not find a single fear it could fasten to. Aemon Sar pushed forward to the rail, and asked the question that no herald had ever needed to ask. He asked the senior weaver why the weave would not take. The weaver's answer was the second thread of cold, colder than the first, and it stayed in Aemon Sar's chest like a swallowed stone. Because they have already seen all of it, the weaver said. Every fear we have, they built ships around them. There is nothing in the human mind we can show it that the humans have not already looked at, on purpose, until it stopped being terrible. They closed their eyes to us for 200 years, Sub-Herald. They were not hiding. They were practicing. Aemon Sar did not understand it then. He would understand it later, all at once, and the understanding would change everything he was. The Veilbreaker came out of the wreck of the 11th Bright Lance, with its scarred flank still glowing, and it did not pursue the 40 survivors who had bared themselves. It let them go. It let them run home to the throne world carrying the truth in their hulls, 40 real ships, where there should have been thousands, and the Earth ship resumed its slow climb up the pilgrim lane toward the throne world of seeming, as if the battle had been a door it simply needed to open. Then it spoke once more to the whole listening galaxy, and this time it did not narrate, and it did not explain. This time it made a promise, and Aemon Sar, who had believed in the seeming the way a fish believes in water, felt the water begin to drain. To every world that has knelt to a painting, the Veilbreaker said, we are coming up the lane to the throne world. When we reach it, we are going to switch off the lights. You are going to see the throne with your own eyes for the first time in 1900 years. We are not asking you to fight. We are only asking you to look. There was a long silence in the showing hall after the promise, and in the silence, Aemon Sar watched the heralds around him begin, slowly, to come apart. Not loudly. Heralds did not come apart loudly. But he saw Olas the Pale sit down on the floor of the hall, which no herald had ever done. And he saw the junior choir readers glance at the doors, and he saw, in a dozen small ways, the thing that happens to people when the one fact they had built their whole lives upon turns out to be a painting. They had served the infinite throne. They had given it their years, and their loyalty, and their pride. And now the infinite throne was being counted on 1,000 choir feeds, and the count was small, and there was nothing any of them could do, because you cannot uncount a number once it is loose. The Eye gave the order to gather the home fleet, the real. On the bridge of the Veilbreaker, Commander Noor Halsey watched the throne world swell in the forward glass, and felt nothing she could call triumph. She had been awake for 19 hours, and she intended to be awake for 19 more, because the hard part had not started yet. The Earth ship had a crew of 410, and not one of them had ever set eyes on the real galaxy until 2 years ago. Halsey's grandmother had been a girl when the seeming first reached Earth. A soft golden pressure on the edge of every human mind, a picture of a throne so vast and so kind, and so absolutely beyond resistance, that the only sane response was gratitude. Half of Earth had nearly knelt to it. The other half had done the strangest, most stubborn, most human thing imaginable. It had refused to trust its own eyes. That was the whole secret. Halsey knew it because she had spent her life inside it. The throne ruled minds by showing them what they could not bear to disbelieve, and Earth had answered by building an entire civilization on the principle of disbelieving everything, on checking, on measuring, on the cold patient habit of trusting the number over the feeling. When the throne showed Earth a kind and infinite throne, Earth had measured the light, found the seams, and started taking notes. It had spent 200 years closing its eyes and learning, by touch, the exact shape of the lie. It had not been easy, and it had not been quick, and it had not been certain. Halsey knew the history because every human child learned it. When the seeming first reached Earth, it had nearly worked. Whole nations had begun to bow. The golden pressure on the edge of the mind was so kind, so total, so obviously beyond argument, that the only sane response seemed to be gratitude, and millions of people had felt that gratitude and meant it. The thing that saved Earth was not courage, and it was not strength. It was a small, ugly, stubborn habit that humans had spent their whole history being mocked for. The habit of the awkward person at the back of the room who raises a hand and says quietly, "I am sorry, but how do we actually know that?" The throne had never met that habit before. It had ruled 1,000 species, and not one of them had built its whole civilization around the awkward person at the back of the room. The throne ruled by feeling, and the awkward question did not care about feeling. It only wanted the number. And when enough humans started asking for the number, and started writing the numbers down, and started comparing the throne's glorious picture against the dull, cold measurements of light and mass and radiation, the seams began to show, one by one, until the whole golden throne stood revealed to Earth as exactly what it was, the most beautiful and most carefully maintained lie in the history of the galaxy. Earth did not announce this discovery. That was the cleverest thing it ever did, and it was Halsey's grandmother's generation that decided it. They knew that the moment Earth told the throne it could see through the seaming, the throne would simply stop showing Earth pictures and start sending ships. So Earth pretended. For 200 years, Earth pretended to be just one more half-kneeling world, grateful and small, and slowly bowing, while underneath the pretending, it measured everything, mapped every thread of the seaming, learned the loom from the outside, and built, in the dark, a fleet of ships designed around a single principle. The principle was the awkward question: how do we actually know that? Every system on the Veilbreaker existed to answer it, to strip the picture off the thing and show the crew only the cold true number underneath. And then it had built a ship that could not be lied to, and sent it up the lane. "Commander," said her sensor officer, a quiet young man named David Rowe, "the home fleet is mustering over the throne world. Real hulls this time. They have stopped pretending." "How many?" 311. Halsey let out a slow breath. The intelligence had said 300, give or take. It was almost a relief to have a number that small be true. And the false projection over them? Rowe checked. About 40,000. 40,000 ships of light wrapped around 311 ships of steel. The throne world hung in the glass, surrounded by a blazing gold ocean of fleet, an armada beyond counting, the single most terrifying sight any species in the galaxy had ever been allowed to see. Halsey looked at it the way her grandmother had taught her to look at everything the throne offered. She looked at it as a problem of arithmetic. "Mr. Rowe," she said, "put the real count on every channel we have. Not the picture, the number. 311. Send it slow, send it plain, and send it to every subject world on the lane. Let them check our math against their own eyes." "They will not believe us, Commander." "Not against that." "They do not have to believe us," Halsey said. "They have to be unable to stop wondering. That is enough. Doubt is a door. We only need to get a foot in it." She had learned that from her grandmother too. You did not free a mind by handing it the truth. A mind that had knelt to the seeming for 1900 years would reject the truth the way a body rejects a foreign thing. You freed it by giving it one small question it could not put down, and then you waited. Because a question is patient, and a lie is not. The lie has to be maintained every single second. The question only has to be asked once. This was the deepest difference between Earth and the throne, and Halsey understood it the way she understood her own hands. The throne thought of war as a thing you did to an enemy. Earth thought of freedom as a thing only the enemy could do to itself. The Veilbreaker could shoot down ships and switch off lies, but it could not make a single mind on a single subject world actually look. That part the worlds had to do themselves, and Earth's whole strategy rested on a quiet faith that, given the choice and given the chance, most minds would rather see than be comfortable. It was a faith Earth had earned the hard way, on itself, 2 centuries ago, when it had stood at the same fork and chosen the awkward question over the golden piece. Halsey was betting the whole campaign that 1,000 other worlds, given the same fork, would choose the same way. She thought they would. She thought wanting to see was not a human thing. She thought it was a living thing, buried under 1900 years of being told not to, and she had come up the lane to dig it back out. Far off, on the throne world, the eye of the throne understood at last what it was facing, and it made the decision that every dying tyranny makes. Since the seeming would not take on the Earthship, the seeming would be turned on everyone else. If the galaxy could not be made to fear the Veilbreaker, the galaxy would be made to fear what would happen to any world that wondered. The eye reached out across the 1,000 subject systems and showed them, all at once, the oldest and most terrible seeming in its keeping. The image it had used only twice in 19 centuries, the picture of a world that had doubted. It showed them Hadrol. 40 systems, the Sword Kings, the empire that had laid down its weapons before the false dying sun. The throne had never actually destroyed Hadrol. It had not needed to. It had simply shown every other world a picture of Hadrol burning, a punishment so complete and so vivid that no one ever checked whether it was real, and for 1900 years, the picture of dead Hadrol had done the work of 1,000 fleets. Doubt, and you become Hadrol. It was the keystone of the whole arch. It was the fear under all the other fears. The eye showed the galaxy Hadrol burning, fresh and new, and under the image it placed a single seeming thought, pressed into 1,000 worlds at once. Doubt the throne, and this is your sky. On the bridge of the Veilbreaker, Noor Halsey watched the Hadrol image bloom across her sensors, as the throne flooded the lane with it, and she did the thing she had crossed the galaxy to do. "Mr. Rowe," she said, "set course for Hadrol." The bridge went still. David Rowe turned from his station. "Commander, that is a 40-system detour. The throne world is right there. If we break off now, the count we just spread starts to fade. They will rebuild the lie." "They will rebuild the lie because the keystone is still in place," Halsey said. "Hadrol is the keystone. The whole arch of fear rests on one picture that no one has checked in 1900 years. We are going to go check it. And if Hadrol really is dead..." Halsey looked at the young man for a long moment, and there was no doubt in her face. because she had not crossed the galaxy on a guess. Earth had spent 200 years measuring the throne's lies, and the very first thing a careful mind learns about a liar is which lie it tells most. The throne told the Hadral lie most. It told it the way a frightened person tells the same story too many times. Earth had run the numbers on the radiation that should still be drifting from 40 dead systems after 19 centuries, and the numbers had come back clean. There was no ash where Hadral should be. There was no graveyard. There was only a picture of one, maintained at enormous cost for 1900 years, which told Earth something very important. It told them the throne was terrified of what was actually at Hadral. "Hadral is not dead, Mr. Rowe," Halsey said. "Hadral is alive and hidden behind the largest seeming the throne has ever built. The Sword Kings did not die. They were taken off the board, and a painting was hung where they used to be, so that everyone else would stay kneeling. We are going to take down the painting." She turned back to the glass, to the gold ocean over the throne world, to the 311 real ships hiding inside 40,000 false ones, and she gave the order that the throne, for all its 19 centuries of seeing, had never once imagined an enemy would give. "Tell the throne world we are not coming for them yet," Halsey said. "Tell them we are going to wake up Hadral first, and put it on every channel, slow and plain, so 1,000 worlds hear exactly where we are going, and exactly why." The Veilbreaker turned off the Pilgrim Lane and ran for the dead systems that were not dead, and behind it, across 1,000 kneeling worlds, the one question that the throne could not afford bloomed in 1,000 minds at once. What if Hadral is still there? On the throne world, in the showing hall, Sub-Herald Amon Sar heard the Earthship's new course, and felt the floor of his whole life tilt beneath him. He had been a child at Hadral. Not a Hadrali, he was a herald born, but he had served his apprentice years on the great seeming that hung over the dead systems, tending the picture, keeping the ash fresh, and he had never once in 40 years let himself ask why a dead empire needed 900 weavers, working every hour to keep it dead. He knew. That was the thing he could no longer not know. He had always known. The dead do not need tending. Only the living need to be kept looking dead. The Eye gave the order to defend Hadral, and for the first time in 1900 years, it sent real ships to do it, peeling 100 hulls off the home fleet and racing them toward the dead systems. Because if the Veilbreaker reached Hadral and switched off the Great Lie, then the keystone was gone, and the whole arch came down, and 1,000 worlds would all look up at the same moment and count 311 ships. 100 real warships against one. The Eye had done this math before, at the Pilgrim Lane, with 200, and it had lost. But it had no other math to do. The seeming would not touch the Earthship. The only thing left was steel, and steel had failed once, and the Eye sent it anyway, because the alternative was to let the keystone fall, and a power built on a single lie cannot survive the lie being checked. Amon Sar watched the 100 ships go, and then he did something that ended his life as a herald, and began whatever short strange thing came after. He walked out of the showing hall, down through the underlevels of the throne world to the old choir archive, and he pulled the oldest record of Hadral, the true one, the one no herald was ever meant to read, and he read what had actually happened to the Sword Kings 1900 years ago. He had to walk a long way to do it. The archive sat at the very bottom of the throne world, below the loom halls, below the quarters of the weavers, in the cold, deep rock where the throne kept the things it did not want even itself to remember. Amon Sar had been down there exactly twice in 40 years, both times on errands he had not understood. The corridors grew narrower and older as he descended, the bright living gold of the upper world giving way to plain bare stone, and he understood, walking down through them, that he was descending out of the seeming itself. Up above, every surface was painted. Down here, in the deep cold, the throne could not afford to maintain the picture, and so the walls were simply walls, gray and honest and unremarkable, and Amon Sar found that his hands had stopped shaking the deeper he went, as though the truth, even the plain ugly truth of bare stone, was easier to bear than the beautiful lie above. The archive door was old. It had a real lock, a physical one, because the throne did not trust the seeming to guard its deepest secret. Amon Sar's rank still opened it, barely. He went in. They had not been destroyed. They had not even been defeated. They had simply, one afternoon, done what no one else had ever done. They had counted the throne's fleet, found it small, and refused to kneel. And the throne, unable to fight 40 real systems with 300 real ships, had done the only thing it could. It had not killed Hadral. It had hidden Hadral, wrapped 40 living systems in the most total seeming ever woven, shown them a galaxy where they had already lost, and shown everyone else a picture of their corpse. For 1900 years, the Sword Kings had lived inside a lie that told them they were the last free world, and that resistance had ended in ash, while the rest of the galaxy looked at the painting of their grave and learned to be afraid. 40 living systems, convinced they were a single dying remnant, 1,000 kneeling worlds, convinced the remnant was already dead. And one gray Earth ship, running flat out across the dark, carrying the only thing that could undo all of it. Amon Sar closed the record. He sat for a long time in the cold of the archive. Then he stood up, walked to the nearest choir station, and did the first free thing he had done in his entire life. He opened a channel to the Veilbreaker, on his own authority, in plain voice, and he told a human warship the exact frequency and weave key of the great seeming over Hadral, the one number in all the galaxy that could switch off the lie from outside. "You will reach Hadral in 9 hours, he said into the channel, not knowing if anyone heard. "The 100 ships will reach it in 7. When you arrive, they will be waiting. But the seeming over the Sword Kings answers to the key I am sending you now. If you can hold the sky long enough to use it, 40 systems will wake up, and they have been asleep and angry for 1900 years." On the bridge of the Veilbreaker, Noor Halsey listened to the alien voice, checked the key against everything Earth had measured, found that it matched, and allowed herself, for the first time in 19 hours, a small hard smile. "Mr. Rowe," she said, "we just got the keystone handed to us by one of their own. Plot us into Hadral. We are going to wake up an empire." The Veilbreaker came into the Hadral systems and found 100 warships of the throne waiting in a wall across the only approach, and behind them, vast and terrible and utterly false, the great seeming that had hidden 40 living systems for 1900 years. Sub-Herald Amon Sar had not lied. Amon Sar watched it all unfold from the throne world, hunched over a stolen choir feed in a corner of the archive, no longer a herald, and not yet anything else. And he watched the Earthship slow at the edge of the trap, and understood the shape of the thing Noor Halsey had to do. She could not run the wall. The 100 ships would gut her. She could not stand off and use the key. The wall would close on her before the weave came down. She had to get into the center of the seeming, plant the key at the heart of the lie, and hold that one point in space against 100 warships for the time it took the truth to load. She had to stand still in the worst possible place, and not be moved. The 100 ships of the throne opened the engagement, the way the throne always opened, with the seeming, 40,000 false hulls blooming around the 100 real ones, a sky of gold meant to break the mind before the guns ever spoke. The Veilbreaker did not even acknowledge it. The Earthship had stopped seeing the false fleet entirely. Halsey had her crew fire only on what the cold sensors confirmed was steel, and Amon Sar watched a human warship drive straight into a wall of 40,000 ships and strike only the 100 that were real, the way a hand reaches through fog to find the one solid thing inside it. It was not a fair fight, Amon Sar had thought, watching the Pilgrim Lane, that the Earthship simply could not be lied to, and that this was its whole strength. He understood now that he had only seen half of it. The Earthship could not be lied to, yes. But the 100 ships of the throne had spent their whole existence inside the lie. They fought wrapped in their own seemings, seeing the battle through 40,000 false friends, never once in their lives having to fight a real enemy with their own naked eyes. And when the Veilbreaker came among them, they did not know how. They fired into their own false fleet. They flinched from ships that were not there. They held formation around painted hulls and left the real gaps open. And the Earthship, which had spent 200 years learning to see nothing but the real, walked through the wall like a surgeon walks through skin. "Hold," Noor Halsey said on her bridge, again and again, as the Veilbreaker took fire and gave it back twofold. "Hold the center. Mr. Rowe, how long on the key?" 11 minutes to load, Commander. The weave is enormous. 1900 years deep. It does not want to come apart. Then we hold for 11 minutes. She said it the way she might have read a number off a chart. And that was the thing her crew loved her for. The thing the throne could never have understood. The throne led by feeling, by glory, by the great loud certainty that swept a crew up and carried it into the fight. Halsey led by being calm in a way that was almost boring, by treating the impossible thing in front of them as one more item with a number on it. 11 minutes was not a feeling. It was a quantity. You could hold a quantity. You held it the way you held your breath underwater, by knowing exactly how long it had to be, and refusing to spend a single second worrying about the second after the last one. Her crew did the sum with her. 11 minutes. They could do 11 minutes. They had drilled worse on purpose, in the dark, for 200 years of family memory. And the drilling was the whole point, because the drilling was where you took the fear out and looked at it until it stopped deciding things. 11 minutes is a very long time to stand still while 100 warships try to kill you. The Veilbreaker took hits that would have ended any ship the throne had ever built, and it kept them off the one place that mattered, the slim, hard line where it had planted Amon Sar's key into the heart of the Great Seeming and begun, slowly, to switch off the largest lie in the galaxy. The gray hull glowed bow to stern with the heat of what it was absorbing. The crew of 410 fought their stations soaked in their own sweat and the smell of scorched air, and not one of them flinched, because they had spent their whole lives practicing not to flinch at things much worse than this. The Earthship did not win by being unbreakable. Amon Sar saw that clearly, and it was the thing that finally broke his faith all the way down to the root. The Veilbreaker was not unbreakable. It bled. It burned. It took wounds that hurt. It won by deciding, every single second, that the wound did not matter as much as the work, and by having spent 2 centuries learning to make that decision faster and colder than any enemy could force it. Amon Sar had been taught, like every herald, that the throne's greatest weapon was that its ships could not be touched, because they were never really there to touch. The enemy fired at pictures, and the pictures did not bleed, and the enemy despaired. He saw now that this had made the throne weak in a way no one had ever named. The throne's ships had never learned to be hurt. They had never learned to keep working with a wound in them, because a picture has no wounds. And so when the Earthship came among them, a thing that could be hurt and went on anyway, the throne's ships had no answer for it, because their whole existence had been built on never being in a fight where hurt was possible. The Veilbreaker was the most dangerous thing in the galaxy, precisely because it could be wounded and did not care. It had made a friend of the one thing the throne had spent 1900 years hiding from. That was the secret weapon. Not a shield, a scar, and the will to keep going while it ached. The throne ruled by making minds unable to bear what they saw. The Earth had built a people who could bear anything, and then they had built a ship out of those people, and sent it to the one place in the galaxy where bearing things was the whole battle. 6 minutes, said Davit Rowe. The commander of the 100 ships, a war herald named Kuldis Vane, understood by now that he could not break the Earthship with fire, and so he did the thing the throne had taught him as the final answer, the thing that had ended 1,000 sieges in 1900 years. He turned the great Hadral, seeming itself into a weapon. He could not aim it at the Veilbreaker, which would not be lied to, so he aimed it at the only living things in reach that still could be. He aimed it at Hadral. The 40 sleeping systems, who had lived for 19 centuries inside a seeming that told them they were a single dying remnant, suddenly had that seeming twisted into something worse. War Herald Vane reached into the Great Weave and showed the Sword Kings their own worlds burning. He showed them the Earthship as an invader come to finish the long-delayed slaughter. He tried, in the last minutes, to make the very people the Veilbreaker had come to free rise up and fight it, so that even if the lie came down, the truth that replaced it would be a truth of human ships above Hadrali fire. Amon Sar's stolen hands clenched on the choir feed. This was the masterstroke, the real horror of the seeming, that it could make the freed turn on their liberators in the instant before they understood. He had seen it work before. He did not see how even the Earthship could answer it. The Earthship answered it by telling the truth louder. Noor Halsey had known this was coming. Of course the throne would turn the seeming on Hadral. Of course it would try to make the prisoners fight for the prison, because that was the only weapon a liar has left, when the lie is failing. So Halsey had not come to Hadral only to switch off the Great Seeming. She had come to replace it, in the same instant, with the one thing the throne had spent 1900 years preventing 40 systems from ever seeing. She had come to show the Sword Kings the real galaxy. "Mr. Rowe," Halsey said, with 2 minutes left, and the 100 ships pressing in, and her hull glowing white. "When the weave comes down, do not leave them in the dark. Push our feed straight into the Hadral Choir. Show them everything. Show them the Pilgrim Lane. Show them the real count. Show them 311 ships. Show them that the galaxy they were told they died fighting is 1,000 worlds still on their knees, waiting for someone to stand up. That is the entire war record, Commander. 200 years of it. Send all of it," Halsey said. "They have waited 1900 years. They have earned the whole story." The key finished loading. The great seaming over Hadral, the largest lie ever woven, 1900 years deep and 40 systems wide, came apart all at once, and for one heartbeat, there was nothing in the minds of 40 trillion living beings at all. No false galaxy, and no true one, just the clean, terrifying emptiness of a people seeing for the first time. And into that emptiness, before War Herald Vane could pour his picture of burning worlds, the Veilbreaker poured the truth. 200 years of measured, checked, patient human truth, flooding into 40 systems at once. The real throne, the real count, the real galaxy, kneeling, waiting. And the real Hadral, alive, undefeated, never destroyed at all, only hidden, only made to believe in its own death so that everyone else would kneel. Amon Sar watched 40 systems wake up, and he wept, because he had spent 40 years tending the picture of their grave. The Sword Kings of Hadral had laid down their weapons 1900 years ago before a painting of a dying sun. They had never picked them up because they had been told, every second of every day for 19 centuries, that they had already lost, that the war was over, that they were the last gasp of a dead thing. Now the lie came off all at once, and they saw the truth in the same instant. And the truth was that they had never lost at all. They had been winning the whole time. They had been so close to victory that the most powerful empire in the galaxy had been forced to spend 900 weavers and 1900 years just to keep them from noticing. Amon Sar, watching, finally understood the size of the thing the throne had done at Hadral, and the size of it made him sick. To hide 40 living systems for 1900 years was not a single act. It was a labor maintained every second of every day for 19 centuries, the most expensive lie ever told. A lie that had consumed more of the throne's strength than any war ever could have. The throne had been pouring the bulk of its power, all that time, into one enormous task, keeping 40 awake systems convinced they were asleep, and 1,000 other systems convinced the 40 were dead. And it had done this for one reason only, because if the Sword Kings ever woke, they would not just be free, they would be proof. They would be the living evidence that the throne could be beaten, that it had been beaten, that the whole infinite empire was so afraid of a single beaten enemy that it had spent 1900 years hiding the body, because the body was still breathing. The throne had not feared the Sword King's fleet. It had feared their example. 40 systems woke up angry. The Hadrali fleet had not been destroyed. It had been mothballed inside the seaming, parked in the dark of 40 systems, its crews living out their lives believing the war was lost, their ships cold and waiting. When the lie came down, the Sword Kings found their fleet exactly where they had left it, and they found themselves remembering, all at once, that they had been a war empire of 40 systems, and that they had laid down their arms not in defeat, but in deception. Amon Sar watched the Hadral dark fill with lights, thousands of them, real hulls coming alive after 1900 years of sleep, and he understood that War Herald Vane's 100 ships were no longer the besiegers. They were surrounded. The 100 ships of the throne had come to Hadral to keep the lie alive. They had hung their whole strategy on a sleeping prisoner. Now the prisoner was awake, and armed, and 1900 years furious. And the Earth ship that had held the sky for 11 impossible minutes stood at the center of it all, scarred and glowing, and entirely unmoved, having done exactly what it came to do. For a few terrible moments, the waking Sword Kings did not know friend from foe. They came up out of 1900 years of false sleep into a sky full of ships, and the first instinct of any war people coming awake into a battle is to fire at everything. Amon Sar held his breath. This was the knife edge. If the Sword Kings, in their first confused fury, turned their reborn fleet on the gray Earth ship that had freed them, then War Herald Vane's last gambit would have worked even in failing, and the truth that replaced the lie would be a truth written in human wreckage. But the Veilbreaker had thought of this too. In the same flood of truth that woke the Sword Kings, Halsey had sent one thing more, placed carefully at the very front of the 2 centuries of war record, so that it would be the first thing 40 systems saw. She had sent them a single clean image of the great seeming itself coming down, the moment of it, the lie peeling away from their own skies, and beside it, plain and slow, the source of the unweaving. Not a conqueror, a key, handed to her by one of the throne's own. The Sword Kings woke up already knowing who had switched on the lights, because that was the very first thing they were shown. And a people who have just been freed do not fire on the hand that opened the door. They turned their fury exactly where it belonged. They turned it on the 100 ships of the throne. War Herald Vane did the math that every servant of the throne eventually had to do. 100 ships, surrounded by a waking war empire, with no seeming left to hide behind, because the Earth ship had switched off every lie for 9 light years. He could not win. He could die, gloriously and uselessly, and take some of the Sword Kings with him, or he could do the thing his War Herald Verotan had done at the Pilgrim Lane. He could choose to let the truth live. War Herald Vane ordered his 100 ships to stand down. He dropped his weapons and his last false seeming, and he opened a plain channel to the Veilbreaker, and Aemon Sar, listening on his stolen feed, heard a servant of the throne speak honestly to an enemy for the first time in his life. "We cannot win this," Vane said. "We were never going to win any of it. We have ruled a galaxy with paintings because we never had the ships to rule it with steel, and you have shown everyone the brushwork. I will not spend my crews to keep a corpse on the throne. Take Hadril. They were never ours. They were only ever asleep." On the bridge of the Veilbreaker, Noor Halsey looked at 100 warships laying down their arms, and 40 systems coming awake around her, and 1,000 worlds back down the lane, all asking the same question at once. And she did not gloat, and she did not press the advantage, and she did not fire another shot. She had not come to kill the throne. Killing the throne was easy now. She had come to do the harder thing. She had come to make it impossible for the lie to ever be believed again. "Mr. Rowe," Noor Halsey said quietly, "open a channel to the throne world, to the eye itself. I want to speak to the thing that has been painting the sky for 1900 years. Tell it we are done at Hadral, and we are coming back up the lane, and that this time we are bringing the Sword Kings with us." She looked at the waking lights of 40 free systems filling the dark around her ship. "And tell it," she said, "to leave the lights on. We want everyone to see what comes next." The Veilbreaker came back up the Pilgrim Lane with 40 awakened systems behind it, and the galaxy had never seen anything like the sky that followed the gray Earth ship home. The throne had ruled by deciding what every species saw. Now, for the first time in 1900 years, 1,000 worlds were all seeing the same thing at once. And it was real. They saw the Sword Kings of Hadral. Not a corpse, not a picture of ash, but a living war empire of 40 systems, with its fleet warm and its banners up, marching up the Pilgrim Lane behind a single scarred warship from a world most of them had never heard of. It is difficult to describe what this did to the subject worlds, because it was not one thing. On some worlds the news came as joy, a sudden wild joy that broke out in the streets before anyone fully understood it, the joy of a long-held breath finally let go. On other worlds it came as terror, because a great many beings had built their entire lives on the safety of the lie, had risen to power inside it, had made their peace with the painted sky, and now the sky was being repainted with the truth, and they did not know where they would stand under it. On most worlds it came as the strangest feeling of all, the one Aemon Sar himself was living through, the feeling of waking from a long dream, and finding the room was the same room but the light was different, and knowing you could never again pretend you had not woken. The throne had given every species the picture it could not refuse. The Veilbreaker had given them all the same harder gift, the picture they would have refused if they could, the true one, and the true one does not let go once it has been seen. They saw the keystone of their fear, the thing they had been told would happen to anyone who doubted, alive and free and furious and coming home. And as the picture spread from system to system down the lane, The great arch of fear that the throne had built over 19 centuries came down, not all at once, but the way a long frozen river breaks, one crack at a time, each crack making the next one easier. Sub-Herald Amon Sar was no longer hiding in the archive. There was nothing left to hide from. He had walked up through the throne world to the showing hall, past heralds who no longer knew what their work was, because the work had always been the lie, and the lie was over, and he stood at the great glass where he had once watched 10,000 envoys weep at a splendor no two of them had ever shared. The glass showed the Veilbreaker now. It showed it plain, because the eye no longer had the strength to dress it. The eye of the throne made its last attempt. Amon Sar watched it happen, and felt almost a kind of pity, the way one pities anything that does the only thing it knows how to do, long after that thing has stopped working. The eye gathered the entire remaining might of the seeming, every weaver who could still hold a thread, the full woven mind of 900 generations, and it built the largest single image in the history of the galaxy. It showed every world on the lane, the throne triumphant. It showed the Veilbreaker destroyed, and the Sword Kings burning, and 40,000 golden ships descending in glory. The old picture, the picture that had always worked, the picture that was the only weapon the throne had ever truly owned. And 1,000 worlds looked at the glorious image, and then looked at the plain feed the Veilbreaker was still broadcasting underneath it, slow and steady and checkable, and for the first time in 1900 years, 1,000 worlds chose the number over the picture. There was a strange mercy in how it ended. The eye did not die in fire. No one stormed the showing hall. The greatest empire in the history of the galaxy simply ran out of believers, the way a fire runs out of air, and went quietly dark. Amon Sar watched the last great image hang in the sky over 1,000 worlds for one long moment, glorious and golden and utterly alone. And then he watched it fade, not because anyone switched it off, but because there was no longer a single mind anywhere on the lane willing to hold it up. A seeming, in the end, was a thing two parties made together, the one who showed and the one who agreed to see. The throne had always pretended it did the showing alone. Now, in its last hour, it learned the truth it had hidden even from itself. It had never been the only one weaving. Every kneeling world had held its own end of every thread, all along, and now 1,000 worlds let go at once. The seeming did not fail because it was weak. It failed because no one believed it anymore. That was the thing Amon Sar finally understood, standing in the ruin of his faith. A lie has no power of its own. It borrows all its power from the people who agree to see it. The throne had not ruled the galaxy. The galaxy had ruled itself, on the throne's behalf, by agreeing every second of every day to see what it was shown, and the moment one gray ship taught 1,000 worlds to check the picture against the count, the agreement ended, and the throne, which had never owned anything but the agreement, owned nothing at all. The Veilbreaker reached the throne world and took up a position above it, one scarred gray ship over the seat of the greatest empire the galaxy had ever known, and the 311 real warships of the home fleet hung in the dark around it, their false thousands gone, naked and small, and finally true. They did not fire. There was no point in firing. The Sword Kings of Hadral filled the sky behind the Earthship, and 1,000 watching worlds were no longer kneeling, and the war was already over, because the only weapon the throne had ever owned had been switched off for good. Nur Halsey opened a channel to the eye, and she spoke to it not as a conqueror, but as a teacher, closing a long lesson, because that, Amon Sar realized, was what the Earth had been from the very beginning, not an empire, a teacher with terrible patience. You ruled with sight for 1,900 years, Halsey said, and her voice went out plain and slow to every world on the lane. So we are going to leave you exactly the way we found you. We are not going to destroy your ships. We are not going to take your throne world. We are not going to kill a single one of you. We are going to do the one thing you cannot survive. We are going to leave the lights on. She let that sit for a moment, over 1,000 listening worlds. From this hour, every world on this lane can see the real galaxy whenever it chooses to look. We are leaving a relay over every system that was under your seeming. It does not project anything. It does not lie. It only lets a mind check what it is shown against what is measured. That is all. You may keep your throne. You may keep your ships. You may even keep painting the sky, if it comforts you. But every world you paint for will now be able to look underneath. And once a mind can look underneath, it never fully stops. You have ruled by being the only one who got to say what was real. From this hour, everyone gets to check. You are not destroyed, you are simply seen. For an empire built on a lie, those are the same thing. The eye of the throne did not answer. Amon-Sar thought it perhaps could not. He stood at the glass and watched the great gold splendor of the throne world flicker and fade as, one by one, the weavers laid down their threads, not on any order, but because there was no longer anyone left who would agree to see what they wove. The throne world appeared, at last, as it truly was. It was beautiful, in a plain way. It was smaller than the picture. It was a real place, and it had always been a real place under all the gold. And that was the saddest and most freeing thing Amon-Sar had ever seen. He found, standing there, that he was not afraid. He had served a lie his whole life, and he had not even known there was anything else to be. Now the lie was gone, and underneath it there was just the world, and the stars, and a galaxy that was about to be far more frightening and far more honest than the painted one had ever been. And Amon-Sar discovered that he wanted to live in it. He wanted to see it with his own eyes. He had wanted that since the moment, days ago, when he first looked at the gray ship climbing the lane and heard a small, clear voice in himself that had never spoken before. That voice spoke again now, and this time he listened to it, and he walked out of the showing hall for the last time. Amon-Sar listened to the human commander speak, and he understood that he was hearing the end of the only world he had ever known, and he found, to his own astonishment, that he was grateful. He had spent 40 years as a servant of the eye, tending pictures, keeping a galaxy from looking, and he had never once, until the gray ship came, questioned whether the work was good. It had simply been the work. He had been very good at it. And now a human captain was explaining, in plain, slow words to 1,000 worlds, exactly what he had spent his life doing. And the words did not sound like a victory speech, and they did not sound like a sentence. They sounded like a teacher closing a long, hard lesson with great patience. And the strange thing, the thing Amon-Sar would turn over for the rest of his days, was that the lesson was offered even to the throne, even to the eye, even to him. Halsey did not say you are evil and you will be destroyed. She said you ruled by deciding what others could see. And so we are going to take that one thing away from you, and leave you everything else, and let you find out what you are without it. It was the gentlest possible cruelty, and the cruelest possible gentleness. And it was, Amon-Sar realized, exactly what the Earth had done to itself 200 years ago, when it chose the awkward question over the golden piece. The humans were not punishing the galaxy. They were inviting it to grow up. The Sword Kings of Hadral did not sack the throne world. Halsey had asked them not to, and they had been free for less than a day, and they found, to their own surprise, that they did not want to. They had spent 1900 years inside a lie that told them they were the last dying remnant of a war already lost. The thing they wanted most was not revenge. It was for no one to ever live inside that lie again. So instead of burning the throne world, the Sword Kings did something far more terrible to the throne. They forgave it. In public, on every channel. And they did so while standing armed and alive and free above its capital. And the whole galaxy watched the corpse the throne had painted for 19 centuries extend mercy to the painter. After that, there was nothing left of the throne's power at all. You cannot rule by fear over a world that has just watched the thing you said was dead choose to be kind. The fate of the eye itself was the strangest part, and Amon-Sar saw it with his own eyes, because by then he had walked all the way up to the threshold of the inner sanctum, where no herald below the first rank had ever been permitted, and no one stopped him, because there was no longer any rank that meant anything. The eye of the throne was not a being. He had always half known this, and never let himself finish the thought. It was a chamber, a great dark sphere at the heart of the throne world, and inside it sat the oldest and deepest of the weavers, the ones whose minds had been joined to the loom so long that they had stopped being separate people, and together they had been the single will that decided what a galaxy could see. Amon-Sar looked into the open sphere, and saw them sitting there in the dark, very old, very tired, their threads cut, and he understood that they had been prisoners too. They had not chosen this any more than the Sword Kings had. They had been born into the loom, raised to be the eye of the world, and they had never once in their long lives been allowed to simply look at something for themselves. The Earth ship had freed them too, though they did not yet know how to feel about it, and perhaps never would. He did not hate them. He found, to his surprise, that he could not. They had done a terrible thing for 1900 years, and they had been the most deceived of anyone, because they had spent their whole existence deciding what was real for others, and had therefore never once had to face anything real themselves. Halsey had been right. The cruelest thing and the kindest thing were the same thing. You took away the eye, and you left them everything else, and you let them find out, at last, what they were, without the power to decide what everyone else could see. Amon Sar did not know what they would become. He suspected they did not either. But for the first time in 1900 years, the question was theirs to answer, and that, he was beginning to understand, was the whole of the gift the gray ship had carried up the lane. On the bridge of the Veilbreaker, Noor Halsey finally allowed herself to sit down. She had been awake for 31 hours. The throne world hung below her, plain and small and free, and 1,000 worlds were waking up across the lane, and David Rowe was reading her the count of newly opened channels faster than he could keep up. "They are all checking, Commander," he said, and there was something close to wonder in his voice. "Every world on the lane. The relays are saturated. They are all looking underneath. Some of them have not stopped looking for hours." "Good," Halsey said. "Let them look. That is the whole point. We did not free them. You cannot free a mind from the outside. We just gave them a window and a reason to use it. The rest, they do themselves. What do we do now?" Halsey looked out at the real galaxy, the one her grandmother had spent her life learning to see, the one Earth had stared at for 200 years, until it stopped being terrible and started being just true. "Now we go home," she said, "and we leave the lights on." The Veilbreaker left the throne world the way it had come, slow and plain and unhurried, a single gray ship that had ruled nothing and conquered nothing, and had broken the greatest empire in galactic history without taking a throne or a world or a life it did not have to. It turned down the pilgrim lane toward the long dark road to Earth, and behind it, the galaxy it left was not an empire and was not a ruin. It was something new. It was 1,000 worlds, freshly able to see, blinking in a light that no one was painting for them, learning the strange, hard, wonderful work of trusting their own eyes. Sub-Herald Amon Sar, who was no longer a sub-herald, and no longer anything the old galaxy had words for, stood on a high terrace of the throne world and watched the gray ship dwindle into the dark. He had spent his whole life believing in the seeming, the way a fish believes in water, and the water had drained away, and he had not drowned. He had simply found, underneath, the ground he had been standing on the whole time without knowing it. He thought about the first message the Earth ship had sent, days and a lifetime ago, when he had still believed the painting was the world. "We learned to close our eyes," the ship had said. "Now open yours." Amon Sar opened his eyes, and for the first time in 1900 years of his people's history, he looked at the real galaxy, and he was not afraid of it, and he understood at last the whole strange truth of the thing that had come up the lane to find them. The Earth had not conquered the throne. It could have. 311 ships against a fleet that had learned, in one terrible afternoon, that it could not even fight, and a war empire of 40 systems, waking up 1900 years angry. The Earth could have burned the throne world down to bedrock, and no power in the galaxy could have stopped it. It had chosen not to. It had chosen, instead, the one act that no conqueror in the long history of the stars had ever chosen. It had decided that the cruelest and kindest thing it could possibly do to a galaxy that had been lied to for 1900 years was simply to let it see. The throne had believed it ruled all. It had believed the picture was the world, because for 19 centuries, no one had ever checked. And then a single warship from a small, stubborn world that had spent 200 years refusing to trust its own eyes had come quietly up the lane, looked at the most powerful lie ever told, and called it what it was. A painting. And then it had switched on the lights, and the painting had become what it had always secretly been, just colored light on a wall, and underneath it, waiting all along, patient and real and finally seen, was the galaxy itself. Amon Sar stayed on the terrace until the gray ship was gone from even the deepest sensors, and then he stayed a while longer, looking at the stars. The real ones. He found that he could not stop looking at them. He suspected he would spend the rest of his life that way, and 1,000 worlds along the lane with him, all of them blinking in the new clear light, all of them slowly learning the thing the Earth had crossed the galaxy to teach, that a lie only rules you for as long as you agree not to look. And that somewhere out past the dark, on a small, stubborn blue world, there were people who had spent 200 years learning to keep their eyes open, who had built a ship out of that one quiet, unbreakable habit, and who would come, slow and plain and patient, to any sky that had forgotten how to see. The galaxy had believed it was ruled by an endless golden throne. It had been ruled, all along, by 311 ships and a single lie. And the lie was over now, because the lights were on, and they were never going off again.